I'm going to introduce myself, Brian Freking. I'm from LaFleur County. I'm the county extension agent in that county, and I've been involved with the meat goat buck test at the Kerr Center. OSU is part of that as well, and so I do have some goat experience as well. Mainly it's been from producers sending their goats to me, and then we try and keep them from dying, right? So what we try to do at that buck test is deal with animals' performance on forages, and that is this section we're talking about. I'm more of a nutritionist. Brian Pugh is our area agronomist, so he knows everything that you need to know about what goes into the ground and how that forage utilizes the nutrients, and hopefully providing me, the nutritionist, all that good quality forage to feed your animals with. So we're going to talk about some of the samples we have in front of you today. We've got a couple of hay bales here, and we're going to talk about quality, how do you get quantity, how do you minimize losses, all those kinds of things. So let's talk about these bales, Brian. What do we got in front of us here?
All right, well, started off last time, you know, everybody's had a little bit of experience in the hay market before, and the hay market is different than a lot of other markets. It's kind of a buyer beware market. You never know what you're going to get. Do they sell hay usually by the pound or by quality? No, it typically goes by what? Bale size, right? So it's a little bit different when it comes to that. Many producers, actually most that we talk to, when we're looking at feed that you buy from the feed store, how many bags of feed have you ever bought that didn't have a tag on it? Probably none, right? Most of them have a tag. They tell you the protein, they tell you the energy, they tell you the minerals that's in there. What about hay? If you go buy hay from your neighbor or somebody down the road, does it have a tag on it? No, it doesn't. So that's one of the differences that we see. We know exactly how many pounds of feed we're getting and what that analysis is, but that's not the case with hay. We need to treat hay that way though, and the reason is if we're feeding supplements to a goat herd, that is just a small portion of the total amount of feed we give them through a winter. Okay, most of what they're getting is right here or it's forage standing in our field. So it's not a good idea for us as producers to, you know, put this hay out there and not have an analysis of it. So that's what we're going to talk a little bit about today. The first thing we're going to look at is visual quality of hay. And I want to ask y'all some questions. I want y'all to tell me what you think. What is a good factor to look at between a couple different types of hay to determine quality? You got to speak up.
Color.
Color.
Good.
Okay, what color is good?
You don't want anything that's like real brown and
Okay.
like that kind of has that moldy look.
All right, and we may get something that's kind of a light tan color like this versus that. Now that can simply be bleached by the sun. If we get a little bit darker than that, that could mean a few things. It could mean that hay was cut in a very mature stage, so it was already brown when it was out in the pasture. What would the quality of that be therefore? Very low. Okay, anytime a plant gets past about 6 weeks of age in its growth, quality goes down very quickly. It could also be very dark brown, maybe matted together. How many of y'all have seen hay like that? Smells a little bit like tobacco. What is that from? Is that good quality?
Got wet. Somebody said, yep.
Yep, that was probably baled too wet, okay? And we can see that tends to damage proteins. It tends to lower the quality in that hay. Animals act like they like it. They like the smell of it, but it's typically not as good for them.
My uncle was the eternal optimist. Whenever his got wet, he said it's just washing the dirt off of it. So,
that's right.
You know, or the dust. So.
That's right. And then also we might see some white down inside this hay. Now what would that white be? Mold, okay, and mold is typically not a good thing either. Doesn't matter what species we're dealing with, we want to stay away from that. So that's good. Visual appraisal, color is typically the thing we see first. What's another thing that we would use?
Stem and leaf.
Stem and leaf. Okay, let's look right here. Let's look at some of that compared to this. Which one looks higher quality? This one? Okay, stem size is another factor we want to look at. The coarser the stems, the coarser the hay, that typically means that it's a less desirable product. Now quality of it might actually still be good, and that's why we do want to go ahead and sample. But typically if we see this real fine stem hay, that tells us it's very young hay, it's higher quality hay, or it's a desirable species such as Bermuda grass. What else? I see something right here on the top of this bale that I don't see as much of over here.
Weeds? Somebody said weeds, okay.
Okay, weeds is one.
Yeah.
Typically, if we see weeds in hay, we would call that lower quality hay, right? But what about with the goat herd?
I love the weeds.
Okay, goats will consume broadleaf forbs. Some people call them weeds. So a lot of times if it's a desirable forb, that may not be a bad thing to have some weeds in our hay. But here's what I'm looking at right here.
Okay.
What is this? Seed heads. Okay, typically if we see seed heads in hay, we have a more mature grass that we've cut, and that typically means quality is lower. And again, I went through here a while ago and I found a couple Bermuda grass heads in here, but in general this is probably a better quality hay because it was baled at a younger stage. The number one factor in hay quality is age. The number two factor is fertility. The biggest factor for yield is fertility. So a lot of people think fertility is the number one thing. It is for yield, it's not for quality. That has to do with age. And as you saw there, Brian, you know, he did that right there. And then this one right here. What's another difference we can look at?
You said it, what was the difference in those? She's saying density.
Density
so weight.
or weight, that's very good. These two bales here, they look very similar, don't they? Just as far as size and all. The weight's quite a bit different. So if we're buying hay by the bale, I'd much rather be buying this than that. So again, we need to be keeping track of the weight of the bale and also some of these visual quality factors. All right, questions on that? Brian, you got anything to add to that?
You know, number one thing for me in nutrition is the quality aspect of it. I'm going to rely on you guys to produce it. So how do I know what the quality is? And that's what we're leading into right next. He's got a device in his hand called a hay probe. And these probes can come in different shapes and sizes. This one is one that's designed for more of your Bermuda type grasses, finer bladed forages. Goes into the bale really easily. In this last year, we've had a lot of alternative feeds like Johnson grass issues or corn stalks. When there's shortages, you find different things to feed. And so by looking at both these hay probes, which one would you think would work better for Johnson grass? A little bit bigger stemmed, the one that Brian Pugh here is showing in his hand. Because it's going to grind that stalk up a little bit more and get a better representative sample.
Okay, sorry to cut you off. There should be a stack of handouts up there on forage sampling. If y'all would, pass that around. How many of y'all have ever seen our OSU fact sheets or our fact sheet webpage?
None in Texas, right? You
Okay.
haven't seen. All right.
All right, most extension services, they have a series of fact sheets on the web. OSU is no different. What I'm passing around is the forage sampling fact sheet. It tells you how to correctly take forage samples, and that's what we're going to spend a little bit of time on today. But you'll probably get many of these through the course of this training, and there's a lot of good information on those. Now we do have two different types of probes here. These are hay probes. We would want to go out and sample our hay, and we talked about visual appraisal, but visual appraisal is not everything. Okay, we really need to take an actual sample, send off to the lab to know exactly how much protein and exactly how much energy. That's going to be relatively cheap. How cheap? If you get just protein, that costs you $6. If you get protein plus energy, which we typically recommend getting both, that's $12. And if you add a mineral component to it, that's going to add another $12. So that's $24 for a sample, $12 if you go with protein and energy. That is some of the cheapest insurance you can get as a producer to know exactly where your forage or your hay is. You know, how much supplement do we need to add? Let's say this is really high quality Bermuda grass hay. It's well above what the animal requires on a daily basis. If I take a sample of that, I might realize I don't need to feed supplement to my goat herd. Where in the past, I've been feeding quite a bit of supplement that's cost quite a bit of money. So you can see it can be a very economical decision to go ahead and spend $12 up front and get a sample. This is a probe here that many of your extension offices will have. This chucks up into a drill, and you simply come up and drill into bales of hay. Do we want to go to just one bale of hay? No. How many would we want to do? A good representative sample, okay? So that kind of depends on how many bales we've got. If we've got 1,000 bales or 100, I try to go around to at least 8 or 10 different places and get a good core out of that bale. That's going to give us an idea of just an overall average of our field. Now, if we're sampling these square bales here, do we want to come up and go in from the side? Why not? Most of y'all will probably feed square bales, I'm assuming, to your goats. Why don't we want to go in the side route here? Pardon me?
You're not gonna get a very good sample because you're just gonna get like the edge there.
Okay, that's
Very
true.
good.
Yeah, a lot of times it will actually part the stems and go down between it. It's harder to get a sample. But also, if you think about how a square baler works, it picks up a portion of that windrow and stacks it into a pad. So if we sample through that pad, we're only taking a very small representative area of our field. Whereas if we come in from the end, we may have a much larger representative area of our field that we're sampling from. All right, and Brian's going to show you how this works. This is a PVC probe, much more simple. Okay, and all that hay that was in that bale is moving up into that PVC tube as he does that. So he would go around to 8 or 10 different places. He would get his samples. His hay comes out. We put it in a bag and we would send it off to the lab. It's that simple. Your county extension office would be the one who would help you fill this out on the outside, send it off. Takes about 10 days through OSU. You've got your test results back. You know what the protein and energy of this bale of hay is. If you do use these, it takes a pretty big drill, about 18 volt, and it's quite a bit more work than what those are. So I really like those on fine stem grass, works great.
Okay, we got a question over here. Not every county office has one of these, and so you know you may end up with one that's the one that Brian had. They've been around a little bit longer, but I've got 2 of these in my office because you saw how easy that was to push that into the bale, and even into the round bales where they net wrap a lot of things. It's a lot easier to get that tip into the side of the bale than spreading that plastic around. So there are some advantage to these things.
Okay.
Yeah, good question.
I'll take a minute and explain it. Basically, we've got a big hollow core, and as that's turning, you've got a little serrated edge here that's cutting. And that's why it works well on corn samples, things like that, corn hay, sorghum Sudan. And then once you're done, once you've taken a couple samples, you pull this off. Of course, your drill is attached to it where my hand is, and then you would pour that into the bag. And then you pop that back on and go back to your next samples.
So it doesn't collect as good as this one does.
Yeah.
We can get 8 to 10 samples out of using this one.
And with this one, you better not do more than 2, or you'll have a hard time using this dowel rod to push it out. It'll pack in there so tightly. Trust me, I've done that before.
Good questions. Anytime anybody else has questions, feel free to jump in there and ask.
Yeah, we want to be real informal. So anytime y'all have a question, that's what we're here for. And that will probably change our discussion a little bit as we go through, but that's what we enjoy, is trying to help you on your terms and for your situation.
Round bale, where would you go in at?
Okay, that's a good question. I think it shows that in your fact sheet there. Go into the side of the bale. Again, we wouldn't go into the flat end, the round end. We would go onto the curved side of the bale. And that's going to be, again, the way that baler wraps that hay up, that's going to get a much larger representative sample from our field. And I would want to go to 8 or 10 bales to get a good average sample. Now, if you've treated any of your fields differently, maybe if you've treated a field the same, but you baled one part of it 2 weeks ago and one part of it today, I would want to sample all of those separately, because that's going to give you different quality levels. And Brian's going to break out some samples here that he's got that are different quality. Now let's just think about this. If we've sent this off to the lab, we send our samples in, we get them back from the lab, we have protein, we have energy, and let's say we sent 3 samples. One of them is a definite lower quality hay. Maybe it was older by the time we could bale it. One of them is a very high quality sample, and then one of them somewhere in between. Which one would we want to feed to our goat herd now, early in the year? Lower quality. Why is that?
The weather's not very good.
Very
Very
good.
good.
Very good. Okay, as we get deeper into winter and the temperatures get colder, it takes more for that goat to maintain her body condition. Therefore, she needs higher and higher quality hay. We can get away with feeding the poorer quality hay now and actually use it up. The animal can get a little bit of good out of it before we really need to ramp up to that higher quality. So that's an excellent point. And then also the stage of production. And Brian will talk a little bit more about this tomorrow with you, I guess, in the nutrition section. What stage of production is that animal in? That will dictate somewhat what type of quality we need to be giving her in her diet. So very good.
So we've taken our sample, brought it to the extension office, and sent it off to the lab. Lab will get the results back to us in about 10 to 14 days. Now that we've got that report, let's go over that report and find out the key components of it. Because really the reason for doing a forage test is to know what nutrients are available for that animal so we can minimize our costs throughout the year. So on day one in your manual, there should be a sheet that has different forage analysis reports. And the very first one is alfalfa listed in there. So just a few pages into day one, you'll see one that says alfalfa. And first thing that comes to mind for me is the test results. At the top of the page it says crop. It says not available, but I put a title on it for alfalfa. The next, so you can send it off and tell them, if it's Johnson grass, if it's whatever, it's a mixture of clover, fescue, whatever. It'll tell you when the results come back which one's which. Or if you want to know the first crop that you hayed in the year, you're gonna put down first cutting. So anything that you report to us, it's going to be on this report sheet. So what do you notice about on there? The next two items are dry matter and moisture. And on alfalfa, it says here the moisture is 20%. Is that good or bad? Somebody says, kind of question, is it bad? Yeah. All right. Typical hay, we hope to shoot for around that 10 to 15%. All right. And why do we want to shoot for that percentage? If we're going to store it in the barn, she's looking at maybe you get up to that 20% or greater, we got a higher risk of it going through some kind of spontaneous combustion, and we're going to lose our barn. So we are kind of at the edge there of alfalfa being too high in moisture. Okay. The next section is crude protein. So we sent this off for crude protein and TDN on this particular test. So the first number, it says 24.4% crude protein, as received 19.5, and as fed 21.7. Okay. Now, what are those three numbers? Which one do I use? As a nutritionist, I balance all my rations on a dry matter basis. So I almost kind of ignore the other ones and look for that one that's just dry matter basis only. All right. The as received is as you send it off. So remember the point about being at 20% moisture? And we got another producer that sends it in at 10% or 12%. It's going to come back and it's going to have a value for that as received. Now the labs want to compare across the state, and that's why you get a third number there that says as fed with an asterisk on it. They try and put it to an equal moisture percentage, which on this case it's 11%. So that would be our number one goal, to have all hay to come in be 11%. But I'm most concerned about the dry matter basis at 24.4% crude protein. Now, I asked you if moisture was a good number. What about that crude protein value for alfalfa? Is that a good alfalfa? I got some shaking their head, yeah. What do you think? You don't have any idea? And that's the thing, knowing what is average for a particular feed ingredient. Corn typically runs around 8 to 9% crude protein. Alfalfa is in this 20% range. This is actually pretty high alfalfa. All right. Just alfalfa pellets kind of comes standard across the industry is around 17%. Okay. So that gives you an idea. You bought this alfalfa, send it off. Now, how good is it? Did I get a good deal on it, or did that guy take me for a sucker? The other thing now, category that we've got on there is TDN. TDN stands for total digestible nutrients, and it is that value that we're looking for energy component. So first we want to meet the animal's protein requirement. Then we want to know, can we actually add weight to it? And the energy value tells us whether we can put weight on that animal. Okay, so any extra that she needs to just maintain her weight goes into gaining weight. And in drought years, we may really be concerned about the energy, or going into the winter when it's cold, snowfall hits, what's that animal do? It's shivering. It requires energy to maintain its body, doesn't it? So we want to know which one's our best feed out there to feed during the different times. Other sheets in there, we've got Bermuda. We've got one there that's ranking crude protein at 10%. And then we've got native at 6%. And our last one is pasture. Brian talked about, a feed tag coming out there. We're actually pouring out feed every day for our animals out there in the pasture, aren't we? We just don't know what value it is and how much they're eating. But you can actually take clip samples of your forage. If you don't know anything about you, move to a new state, you don't know anything about your forages, maybe taking a clip sample every month might give you a better idea of what those animals can eat. And I've actually done that for the Kerr Center for several years and designed a mineral program based off the forage analysis reports that I get. So it can come in very handy for a $12 or a $24 sample to get quite a bit of value out of that. All right, and so this last one that says pasture, notice it's got a lot more numbers on it. It gives you things like your mineral content then. So we've got calcium, phosphorus. All those numbers are important. Typically the calcium and phosphorus is the one most of us are concerned with in goats, especially with the males. Anybody had issues with urinary calculi? Okay, urinary calculi is one of those things that if you're in the show goat industry, we feed a lot of grains to it, and we can get imbalances. And it's the imbalance of calcium-phosphorus ratio where we want it to be 2% or 2 to 1 calcium to phosphorus ratio. In our grains, we tend to have high in phosphorus, so we get an imbalance, and that's why we run into those urinary calculi problems. Alfalfa, most of your forages are normally higher in calcium, so we tend to not have those problems on grass-based systems. Okay.
You said you can take a clip sample, so you literally just go out and clip some off and haul it in?
Yep.
Yeah. And again, Brian, do you want to talk about how you would take a random sample on that?
Yeah, what I would try to do, a very simple tool to kind of give you an area to clip would be like a coat hanger or something like that. You could actually open a coat hanger up, and I would take it out there, and now don't look, but throw it over your shoulder. And the reason I say don't look is because there's actually been quite a bit of research done that when people look at where they're going to put that down, they always go to either the worst spot or the best spot. Okay, so I would throw that over my shoulder and take 5 or 6 clippings just randomly out there in that pasture. Again, you could walk a zigzag and just hit 5 or 6 different points, clip those off, and then you could send that in again through the office to the lab and get a good representative sample of where that forage is at. But that's actually how we do a lot of our research. We'll go out and to get numbers like you're going to be seeing this week, we'll go out and take forage clippings like that so we know the quality, on a week-by-week basis. That's definitely something you can do too if you're interested in it.
Interesting component to this last year's buck test was that when I took those samples in June, July, and August, think about the weather. What was it like? Hot, dry. It's just like this. It was basically dry, standing hay out there. It was 75% dry matter. When other years where we had Katrina, we had lots of rain, those kinds of things, it was almost the opposite direction where it was 60 to 70% moisture. And so those animals were getting a lot of green forage out there, but they had to consume a lot because of the dry matter percent. All right, so again, these tests can come back with a lot of information on them to help you fine-tune your feeding operation. So knowing that it was dry, and if I was deficient in crude protein, then I could supplement them with some type of a crude protein source like soybean meal or cottonseed meal.
Okay, and that's the whole point that we're trying to get across here today, is that by taking these samples and by knowing what your protein and energy levels of your hay is, we might be able to reduce the amount of winter supplemental feeding that we go through, or also we could become a more educated hay buyer. If we're purchasing hay from someone, a lot of this information here can help us buy better hay at less money, and that's really the name of the game. I want to talk about a few other things when we're looking at quality of hay. Okay, so now we've sent off a sample, we've got it back, we know the protein and energy. That's really the #1 baseline for us knowing how much to feed. And Brian will go more into that tomorrow, I'm sure, in the nutrition section. But we had a question in the last group, what about weeds? And some people like the term weeds, some don't. Typically, if we're talking about goats, we call those broadleaf forbs. What if I had a hay bale here and it was 50%, let's say ragweed and curly dock, and would that be a problem? Cerisa.
Not for goats, she said.
Okay, that's a good point. So a lot of what we're talking about today is kind of geared towards goats. If you were looking at a cattle producer or a horse producer, you have 1 or 2 weeds in that square bale of hay and they don't like that, right? But with goats, that's not a problem because goats will consume many of those broadleaf forbs. So that's a very good point. Weedy hay, therefore, in our discussion, sometimes doesn't play in. And Dr. Sparks, we talked last time, I don't see him here now, he actually feeds quite a bit of Cerisa lespedeza hay to goats. Not many cattle producers want anything to do with that. Definitely no horse producers because of the high tannin levels in it. But for goats, that's a very good quality hay. So a lot of that will depend on the species you're dealing with. And we've got a little bit more of a range when it comes to goats for the type of hay we can feed.
Who can tell me what this is? Cottonseed? It's the hull. It's the basically before you extract any cottonseed meal or like soybean meal, it gets extracted. It's just the meal part of it. Well, can a goat or a cow, anything survive on this alone, you think? No. So got some shaking their head. No. Good. I'm glad to hear that. How would you like to be fed some kind of a cotton ball breakfast, dinner, and supper? All right. So anytime we talk about hay or some special deal that your feed salesman's trying to sell you, usually one ingredient is not going to meet all the animal's requirements. Now, alfalfa is probably one of those forages that comes closest to meeting most of the nutrients that it needs, but even with alfalfa at 24%, we're overfeeding crude protein. And that's one of those things that we talk about. We can get by with eating ribeye steaks every meal, can't we? We can do it, but it's expensive, so it's not cost effective to do that. So we can utilize some of these ingredients like these cotton burrs in a small percentage of the ration to cheapen our ration out. This is high in actually fat, so it has about a TDN level of around 95%. So it is high. Problem is it's got some characteristics called gossypol that can give animals some reproductive problems with the semen quality, those kinds of things. It also has some values on it that decreases the digestibility of our forages. Anytime we get fat, too high a fat in a feed ingredient, the digestibility of the bugs that are working in that animal to digest those forages gets decreased. All right. So this one is high in fat, and that's why the TDN value is very high. So you want to limit this to 10 to 20% of the total ration in cotton burrs. I gave you a sheet that has some animal pictures on it. It's got a doe on that. I'm going to steal yours just for a second. So if we look at this doe right here, and then I've got a call out button here that shows some numbers. We buy feeds a lot of times, and it may be a 14% pellet, creep pellet or something like that, right? So we know that in percentages what we're buying. Now, what do we feed animals though? We feed them in pounds, don't we? So all the nutrient requirements are listed on this sheet for the animal you're feeding in pounds, and then I try and extrapolate it for you in the percentages. So that 176 pound doe on the bottom there eats about 3 pounds of dry matter, which is about 2% of her body weight. So just to maintain a doe that size, she's eating 2% of her body weight. We look at some other animals, where younger animals, they're going to have a higher percent of their body weight requirement. Now the crude protein is 6.8% for that animal, and the TDN is 53%. So we look back into our books, native hay was around 6%, wasn't it? And the TDN, I think somebody can help me out, it was in the 50s. I don't remember if it's 54 or 53. So we've actually kind of met that dry doze requirement using pretty poor quality forages, hadn't we? Now when she has kids, that's where we start running into that jumping up in these crude protein analysis. We need to start supplementing her with different feed ingredients. So right there, this little sheet's kind of handy to have with you. We are going to go in today 2 or 3 doing more of a computer program, and I'm going to ask you to feed different things and see if you'll meet the animal's requirement, okay? Any questions on that little sheet so far? Okay.
All right. Y'all all have the collecting forage samples fact sheet, right, that we passed out. We'll be giving you a website how to get to all those fact sheets. One other one that I do want to tell you about is 2588, and that is hay judging fact sheet, and it kind of goes over the basics of the visual appraisal that we've talked about here, how to select that truly high quality forage based on visual appraisal. So, you know, we talked a little bit in the last group. If you go out and you're wanting to buy hay, what would be the ideal thing to do before you ever purchased a bale of hay? What would you want to look at? Okay, you might want to look at the pasture or the hay itself. What would be another good thing that we've talked about here that you would want to look at? Where'd your samples go here, Brian? Here we go, right here. How about that right there? Forage analysis, right? How many of y'all have bought hay and actually looked at a forage analysis ahead of time? That typically doesn't happen. Again, we've talked about some of the downfalls of the hay market. Typically, it's a buyer beware market, so you're going to have to go out and use some visual appraisal. But if you do have someone that you work with that will take one of these samples for you before you purchase it, I would highly recommend that. We could sit down and make sure it's the protein and energy level that we need before we purchase that hay.
How many have bought round bales of hay? Quite a few you have. Do you know how much they weigh?
Right.
Yep.
About 20 minutes.
Gotcha.
Okay, thanks.
On this sheet, I've given you a chart on the bottom as well. The University of Texas A&M, I believe, did some research on bale weights, okay? And so when we buy round bales of hay, we are kind of, again, like he said, at the mercy of the sellers. But at least in this little chart, you can find out if I'm buying 4x5s, what is the typical weight. And this was based on Bermuda. If we're getting corn stalks or we're getting Johnson grass, these weights are going to be different. All right, so I put one of the most common Bermuda grass hay bales in the weights. So a 4x5, how much does a 4x5 bale weigh typically? 880 pounds. So the biggest lie in our business is that 1,000-pound cow and the 1,000-pound round bale, right? Because we see that sold all the time, and it really weighs about 880 pounds. So how much does a round bale cost nowadays? $50 a roll? 60, 80, 100? All right.
Where you buy it.
Yeah.
Depends on where you buy it.
That's right.
Yeah. So now that we know the weight, we can actually figure out how much are we paying for each pound of crude protein, each pound of crude or of TDN from those bales. So that 50-pound roll may cost us more like on this, it's saying here 113 pounds per ton. Because that's one of the things we would love to have sellers sell us to is by the ton.
And Brian brings up a good point. I mean, that is the ultimate end goal of what we're doing here, is trying to determine the value per pound of protein or the value per pound of energy. And we might actually find out that we can purchase a hay that meets our goat's requirements based on that chart that he gave you and be very competitive in price, maybe even cheaper than what we could buy, say, a supplement for. So again, we might be able to do on just hay alone. And if that's possible, we can really affect the bottom line of our system, how much money we're going to make at the end of the year. I want to talk a little bit more about the hay chart you were looking at there and the size of those bales. A good rule of thumb that we use in a lot of our presentations, a lot of our programs, is that a 6-foot tall bale, now that's a pretty good sized bale, and the outside 6 inches, how much weight do you think that is? What percentage of that bale is in the outside 6 inches of a 6-foot bale? It's actually about 33%, or 1/3 of that bale is in the outside 6 inches. And I know that doesn't seem right, but if you start to think about it, you're unrolling that bale, the largest portion of hay is in that outside roll. So how many of y'all have ever seen a bale of hay that has 4 to 6 inches that's been weathered on the outside? It's brown, it's maybe half rotten. Animals are not going to eat that, right?
Where do they eat the bale? What's the first part they eat?
The center. So how much hay could we potentially lose when we see that dark ring on the outside? A lot. And probably would be good if we spent a little bit of time talking about how we can conserve some of that hay. And
one of the ways is by the way we feed it. So a lot of you raised your hand, you are buying round bales or producing your own round bales. How do you feed it out? Do you just put it out there for a week's time to eat? Or do you put it in hay rings? Have limited access to those things? Do we get it off the ground? So Brian, my question to you is, what's the % loss that we'd normally feed if we just put a round bale with nothing on it?
Okay. If you just put a round bale out, don't have any type of protection for it, and you don't have enough animals to consume that bale pretty rapidly, you're probably looking at 40 to 50% dry matter loss on that bale of hay. And we see that in a lot of scenarios every year. If we're looking at using just a round bale ring, we can get that down to around 10 to 15%. And there are actually some cone type feeders that hold the hay up off the ground, and we get it down to around 5%. Yeah.
Yep.
And why do you think that is? Why do you think we reduce the loss so much if we pick that bale up off the ground?
They lay around on it.
Lay around on it?
Okay, well we have something to protect it, keep them from stepping on it and laying on it. What else? What about picking it up off the ground even 4 inches? What does that do?
It cuts down on the moisture.
That's exactly right. It keeps that bale from wicking moisture up out of the ground, and when that happens and that bale gets wet, the animals are going to refuse that. So anything we can do to get it up off the ground and protect it is sure going to help us. I think it's also good we talk a little bit about storage. Hay storage. How many of y'all have some type of a storage shelter for your hay?
Got a couple, 3, 4.
Okay, good. There's been quite a bit of research done in the southeast United States on hay loss that's been stored outside. And we'll spend a few minutes here, we'll talk about round bales. I just really don't recommend having square bales unless you're going to put it in the barn. But most of us know that. You know, our parents, our grandparents, that's the way they've done it for a long time. Round bales, though, we typically stack them outside. A lot of these studies have shown, though, that in 6 to 9 months, now that would be baling it in the summer and feeding it this next winter, our losses can be anywhere up to about 25 to 35%, okay? And that's just from, again, that ring, that weathered ring on the outside of the hay bale. If we decide to store that hay over until the next year, so about 18 months, what do you think that does to the amount of loss? Gets much higher, doesn't it? And it can actually be 50% or a little greater. So if we look at the amount of hay that we lose just from dry matter loss due to weathering, and then also the amount of hay that we could lose from the way we're feeding it to the animals, you can see we could have a very substantial loss of hay. And has hay been cheap the last 2 years? No. And you know, looking at that, looking at the cost or the value of our hay, most economists will tell you that somewhere around 5 years we'll usually pay for a hay shelter to stack round hay 3 high. Okay, now that's pretty good. And Brian mentioned
In the last group, if you're not aware of it, there are other agencies that help you out in you know, some low-income loans to build these hay storages. 1% is what I've been told in Oklahoma. So a real low interest loan to build hay storage, and if it's going to pay for itself in 5 years, you know, that's wonderful. Now, these cone feeders we talked about a few minutes earlier about limiting our losses, you know, they're expensive too because it's a lot of metal, right? All right, so a lot of times we go to the store to buy and we find out which one's the cheapest, all right? But that cone feeder, if it saves you, whereas one is at 25% loss and another one's at 7% loss, how long does it take to justify it? And I figured out for that cone feeder for cattle operation that we could justify that cone feeder, even though it cost $700, $800, about 40 bales to pay for itself. Okay? And most of our normal cow producers out there run about 40 cows per herd. And so you normally feed at least 1 bale through the winter for each cow. So you can pay for a cone feeder in about a year's time. That's the way I've figured that out, based on the amount of savings that you would have in losses, okay, or potential losses. Go ahead.
Let's touch the unrolling aspect for a minute. How many of y'all unroll round bales? Nobody?
Got a few? Unroll
For horses? Okay, we get quite a bit of questions about that, especially in years when we have some hay shortages due to drought, and unrolling will work. Now, if you look at a lot of the research, they show very high losses for unrolling hay, and the reason that is because we're feeding it with too few animals for too long a time. Okay, if we unroll enough hay for 4 or 5 days worth, what do you think's going to happen? They're going to go bed down on it, right? That's an awesome, soft, comfortable bed for them to lay on. But if we put enough out there for 2 to 4 hours worth of their consumption, we tend to get away from a lot of those losses. So hay unrolling can work. It is a way to ration hay back. Typically for most goat producers though, we're going to be looking at square hay, and we can more finely tune how much hay we're going to put out there for them on a daily basis.
Another thing that I don't know if any goat producers have tried yet, it's worked in cattle, is limiting the amount of time they have access to that hay. All right. Fundamentally, if you have cows out there that eat 24 hours in a day at a hay ring, they're going to pull some out, throw it down on the ground, get what they want. If we limit them to 6 to 8 hours, they get the same amount of consumption and when we don't have those hay losses. So that might be something as goat producers you may want to experiment with as well. Problem with that is you've got to have a place to put that hay every day and shut the gate on them, right? So if you're in the pasture situation, you know, not all of these management tools will work for everybody. We're going to throw some of these out there for you to see which ones work best for you. Okay. Clovers, we've talked a little bit about those. Let's go back to the pasture situation. How can we improve? Do goats like clovers? Or do they prefer the browse that we talked about earlier?
No, they like clovers.
They like clovers too. So they like the most high quality forage as well. And they'll actually try to go back to them and consume them and overgraze them, won't they? All right, that's typical of any animal. Again, we can get by on ribeye steaks every day if we want to, and that's the same theory that the animals like. They want to go to the best quality stuff. Now, forages do change throughout the year due to the environmental conditions. What happens to a grass after a Bermuda grass that's typically 8% and dry? What happens after a frost? Brian, do you want to go into some of those? What's
Sure.
the quality of that?
Yeah, I would like to talk a little bit about the what we call stockpile grazing. Okay, and that's a way we can go into fall. We can be growing forage out in the pastures, and we would get a frost, as Brian says, a killing frost that stops that grass, turns it brown. Now, a lot of people think at that point maybe our quality is gone. You know, we should have baled it, we should have put it up. Actually, that is still high quality. Okay, if we were to go in, say, the first week of September and mow off all existing forage, so it's real short, and then put down some fertility and get some rains and let that forage grow, it's going to be high quality. Now, we talked a little bit about, you know, 5 to 6 weeks, plants are high quality. Once we get to around 8 weeks or so, quality drops off quickly. Well, what happens about 6 to 7 weeks after the first week of September? Frost, usually a killing frost. So what we've done is we've stopped that plant in a very high quality state. And that can be a standing hay crop. We don't need to go out there and bale that, haul it to a barn, then haul it back out to our goats. I'm a big fan, I know Brian's a big fan. You know, cattle and goats were made to consume their own forage. They're much more efficient at doing that than what we are with a hay baler. So let's make them consume their own forage, and in this case it would be a standing hay crop. And that can really reduce a lot of the input costs that we have. So again, fall fertilized warm season forages like Bermuda grass work very well. Then we've also got, you know, a load of cool season forages we can use that can help extend our grazing season into the winter months and reduce the amount of hay we need to feed. And we'll talk a little bit more about those tomorrow in the forages section. I think we'll have about a 2-hour block where we can really sit down and play with different ideas and see what would work the best for your operation.
Okay, we've thrown a lot of things out there for you. Are there any other questions that we didn't cover? I know you're going to get a lot of things thrown at you in the next couple days, but go ahead and ask these at this time if you would like.
If you don't have a place to put your round bales and kept at it, what's a way to keep it, I mean, that's safe?
keeping it from losing a lot of the nutrient values. Good
Okay.
question. Just outdoors, we can do a lot of things with pallets to get them up off the ground a little bit. Putting gravel down where the moisture doesn't get to those bales as easily. Go ahead.
Stack them in north-south rows. You know, we typically get good sun from the south and wind from the south, and that will keep those bales dried out pretty well. And you know, leave some distance in between those rows, 3 to 4 feet, but stack the round part, the ends of the bales tied against each other, and that will help shed water. Also net wrap. You know, we didn't really talk much about wrapping, but net wrap in a lot of research studies has shown that it does reduce the amount of hay loss just because it holds a tighter shell and sheds moisture better.
They make tarps, of course,
Yep.
for stacks. Some of them are individual bale, you know, wraps as well that are plastic. We didn't talk about silage very much in this group. There are a lot of machines now being sold for creating silage because it is difficult to put up hay at a convenient time in March because we normally get it rained on, right? And so that's one of those areas that we could use, but there are a lot of management issues on silage as well. Typically it's twice as much moisture, so you're actually going to have to put up twice as much forage to get the same result. Okay. Well, we appreciate your time this morning, and
thank you.
I hope to get to know each one of you a little bit better as the days go through.